The story begins in 1993 in Missouri with 17-year-old Christopher Simmons, who deliberately created a plan to commit burglary and murder and also he told his friends, Charles Benjamin of 15 years old and John Tesmer, who was 16 years old, that he thought he could get away with it because he was minor. Then, on September 9, Simmons met with Benjamin and with Tesmer at 2 a.m. to carry out their plan. But Tesmer decided to leave before any crimes were committed because he was afraid. Then, Benjamin broke into the home of Shirley Crook, then duct-taped her, and while she was still alive and conscious, she threw her off a railroad trestle bridge in the Merrimack River, where Crook's body was discovered that afternoon by a group of fishermen. Simmons was heard bragging about the murder, and later that day he told his friends that he had killed a woman. The day after the murder, the police arrested Simmons and Benjamin at their high school after receiving a tip that they were being involved in the murder. And then at the police station in Fenton, Missouri, Simmons waived his right to an attorney and agreed to answer questions. Then Simmons initially denied involvement, but later confessed to the murder and agreed to perform a videotape reenactment of the crime scene. Simmons was tried as an adult because the jury found him guilty and the trial court imposed the death penalty. To his accomplice, Benjamin, the original lower court sentence was life without parole. Then Simmons moved before the trial court to set aside the conviction and the sentence sitting in court because of ineffective assistance of a counsel. Because of his age and those impulsiveness, along with a troubled background, being brought as issues that Simmons claimed that should have been raised at the sentencing phase, the trial court still rejected the motion and Simmons appealed. Then came the turning point where the Supreme Court in 2002 decision in the Adkins versus Virginia case, which they banned the death penalty for the intellectually disabled. Following that precedent, Simmons filed a new appeal, where the Missouri Supreme Court took a dramatic step, concluding that a consensus had now developed against executing juveniles. So they reversed Simmons' original death sentence, resentencing him to a life imprisonment without parole. Missouri appealed that decision, sending the case to the highest court, which is the U.S. Supreme Court.
In 2003, the Supreme Court of Missouri modified Simmons' original sentence. They based its decision on the fact that only a few number of states allowed the execution of minors, and that only a few cases had been carried out in recent years. They analyzed the legislation and the judicial practices that followed the trend of rejecting the capital punishment for minors. In light of this trend and the interpretation of the Constitution of the U.S., the court found out that the sentence of Simmons' case violated the 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel punishments. So they concluded that the original sentence must be replaced with life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court also stated that given the immaturity, vulnerability, and reduced responsibility of minors, the capital punishment could not be considered proportional or constitutional in these cases. The main legal issue in this case is the imposition of death penalty on minors, which violates the U.S. Constitution. The court also needed to analyze international and national practices and comparative law to determine if they reflected a consensus that death penalty on minors is unacceptable, inhuman, and disproportionate. In particular, the discussion revolves around whether society and the law consider that minors have the sufficient responsibility to justify such a severe punishment. On the other hand, the moral issue discussed in this case is if it is acceptable to execute minors whose cognitive, social, and emotional abilities are still developing. The debate also questions whether society and law has the obligation to protect minors from this kind of punishments that can be disproportionate and cruel for them. And it also raises the question of whether that penalty reflects a justice system that respects human dignity, or whether if it violates fundamental principles related to the protection of such vulnerable groups.
The case reached the United States Supreme Court due to the fact that Donald P. Roper, superintendent of the Potosi Correctional Center, appealed the decision of the Supreme Court of Missouri, arguing that allowing a state to overturn a Supreme Court decision by looking at evolving standards would be dangerous because under these circumstances, state courts could just easily decide that executions prohibited by the Supreme Court were not permissible due to a change in the beliefs of American people. However, in a 5-4 opinion delivered by Justice Anthony Kennedy, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that standards of decency have evolved, so now executing minors is considered cruel and an unusual punishment prohibited by the 8th Amendment, and therefore they determined that applying the death penalty for juvenile defendants is unconstitutional. If we were judges on this case and considering its workings interpretavism theory, we would state that under no circumstances then applying death penalty to a minor is acceptable. First of all, because death penalty itself undermines human dignity and also a fundamental right, which is the right to life. And furthermore, as we're talking about a minor in this case, this factor must also be taken into account, as he cannot be judged as an adult since he has not fully matured and must be protected under this basis.